Order, order. The Science and Technology Committee is in session. This morning we look at some of the implications of the findings of our report into space strategy and UK satellite infrastructure, in particular in the context of the launch attempt that took place in Cornwall a little while ago. And we are being joined by witnesses from the sector and from the regulator. We, in fact, are hearing evidence from witnesses from Australia to the west coast of the United States and, of course, in person here. So we're very grateful to our international witnesses for joining us. Let me introduce our first pair of witnesses, and they are joining us from Melbourne. Josh Weston, who is the Chief Executive and the co-founder of SpaceForge, which is an in-space manufacturing company, building the world's first returnable and relaunchable satellite platform. Prior to this, Josh Weston held roles at the UK Space Agency and Thales Alenia Space. And Patrick McCall joins us in person. Mr. McCall is a non-executive director of SpaceForge, and is a venture partner at Seraphim Capital, a London-based space technology venture capital company. Prior to this, Mr. McCall worked for 2 decades for the Virgin Group, including as chair of Virgin Orbit and Virgin Galactic, and he was also previously a board director at OneWeb. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, SpaceForge is a Welsh-based company. Were it the case, and appropriate for St David's Day,
Yes.
Had things gone according to plan, your satellite, Forge Star 0, would have been the first satellite that was developed and manufactured in Wales to be launched into space. We're obviously very disappointed that it didn't work out as you intended. Perhaps, Josh, you might just tell us a bit more about what your satellite was going to do and how it came to be put into the Virgin launch.
Forge Star 0, as said, is the first satellite designed and built in Wales. It was designed to validate the safety and regulatory case around developing a returnable satellite for the first time ever, specifically so that return of space vehicles could be conducted to the UK and to wider Europe. It's a different re-entry technology. You're probably familiar with something like SpaceX Dragon or the Space Shuttle from America. Our re-entry technology, the way that it works, is best described as Mary Poppins from space. It's a large deployable umbrella that allows us to essentially float from space back to orbit. So what we were doing was developing a demisable version of that platform, really to demonstrate to the CAA and other European regulators that we were able to do this safely and routinely ahead of moving up to our full-scale operations on Forge Star 1 and Forge Star 2.
You haven't been able to do that testing, obviously, because the launch didn't work. So what's your next step? How are you going to perform that, obviously, required testing?
So we've had to shift the objectives that we were looking to achieve from Forge Star 0 onto Forge Star 1. Forge Star 1 itself is a much more capable platform, launching later this year. It's about 10 times the size of Forge Star 0. However, because we haven't been able to demonstrate some of the safety procedures, it itself will also not be capable of a full return, because we need to be able to demonstrate essentially a worst case scenario on trying to return something from space to European territory.
Where are you intending to launch Forge Star 1 from?
Forge Star 1 is going to be launching from the States.
Whereabouts in the States?
As yet, we don't know, either Florida or Vandenberg. It's going up on a SpaceX.
Right. Well, obviously you were intending to launch from Cornwall. You attempted to launch from Cornwall. Why did you want to do it from Cornwall in the first place? Was that important, or was that symbolic?
We were offered a ride quite late on in the journey to go on Virgin Orbit from Cornwall. First and foremost, there was a profound opportunity in being part of an incredibly historic event. At the same time, we were keen to demonstrate a lot of the flexibility with our platform, late stage integration, being able to deploy a returnable platform with a launch via Cornwall rather than having to go over to America to do so. I mean, it's only a short trip down the M5 and then the A roads to get there. So it offered us much greater flexibility with the team and meant really that we didn't have to staff a team in Florida for an extended period of time.
So why have you decided that the next launch will be from the United States, given that what we understand is that this was a technical fault or set of faults? These things happen in space, but there's every intention to launch from Cornwall as soon as possible.
So we unfortunately don't know when the next launch from Cornwall is going to be. As a startup, we can't afford to wait. So Forge Star Zero, along with the rest of the Virgin Orbit launch, was originally scheduled for a launch in, I think, July of last year. It being delayed till January of this year narrowed the gap between us and our competitors to around 6 months. The launch then not succeeding now means that we're around 6 months behind our competitors in deploying this technology. SpaceX and the Forge Star 1 mission was actually booked prior to Forge Star 0 being a development pathway. So Forge Star 0, we were offered the opportunity in January of last year. So we paused work on Forge Star 1 to pivot essentially to Forge Star 0, acknowledging the need to demonstrate some of the safety of operations and some of the other considerations around developing return capability, which Forge Star 0 afforded us without having to essentially repeat those tests on Forge Star 1, which we're now in the position of having to do.
I see. Now, when I introduced you, I said that you'd had roles in other organisations, including in the UK Space Agency. So you're familiar with how things should be or could optimally be organised. Was it inevitable that the delays, the 6-month delays or so that the Cornwall launch was subject to should have happened, or were you disappointed by that? Were you surprised by that?
Yeah, we were surprised, especially because our platform was designed, developed, and qualified in 5 months. So we pulled out all of the stops to be ready for that original July timeline. I can't speak as to why there were some of those delays. Simply, I don't know. What I would say is that where we have been able to engage with the regulators, the engineering teams have performed admirably. They're excellent to work with. But the gaps between those engagements, I would probably share the view of just beyond Space Forge that I imagine others have also suffered from those delays and those gaps between engagement, which inevitably have a knock-on impact on the license.
And obviously you've dealt with other regulatory jurisdictions. Can I infer that that's not your experience with those other regulators or jurisdictions?
Indeed. So the two examples that I have are Portugal and Australia, where I'm speaking to you from today. So in Australia, for example, they quote a 6-month timeline from submission of a complete application to license award, and there is no licensing fee. That's very different to the CAA of 12 months and at least a 5K fee for the application itself, notwithstanding the resource requirement on submitting that license. And Portugal, where we're looking to conduct our initial return operations, simply because proximity to the Atlantic. We are currently in discussion with them, but at the moment it's looking to be around 12 to 15 times cheaper per day using their restricted airspace to be able to conduct our business.
And how do you account for that, given that Portugal is, in a sense, competing with the UK to be the first European launch facility and subject to, one would have thought, sort of similar standards of safety and regulatory certainty that one would aspire to. So what are they doing differently in Portugal, to take that example? Australia, perhaps you might cite as well. What's your experience there compared to what you experienced in the UK?
So I can't really speak to the launch side, only the satellite operation and the return capability. But in both cases, Australia and Portugal recognize FAA approval from the US and have effectively adapted those regulations to fit their own geographies as ways of stimulating some of their perhaps smaller space economies than compared to the UK. what I would say is different between Portugal and the UK is really the pace and the touch points with the engagement. So we have either somebody from their government or somebody from their regulator pretty much speaking with us on a weekly basis to move forward their own process to be ready for a return operation toward the end of this year.
And you said a weekly basis in those cases. How frequent was the interaction in the UK case?
It was highly dependable. So sometimes it may only be a couple of weeks. Other times we were waiting up to 6 weeks. There was a real jarring between the submission of the license and the license application via the portal could only be submitted once. What that then meant was that when the CAA teams had questions, we then had to go via email to answer those questions, which then obviously put there were significant differences both in size, detail, etc., between the portal submission and what we were actually detailing to the CAA. So, quite frankly, it cost us more to license our satellite for launch than it did to launch it.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Can I turn to Mr. McCall? You've obviously heard what your colleague said there, and just as Mr. Weston, you've got a long and illustrious career in the space and satellites sector, not least as chair of Virgin Orbit and Virgin Galactic. Could you just perhaps add to your colleague's perspective on this, given your experience of the industry? Why have things been so disappointingly slow here in the UK?
I think there's, as Josh has pointed out, this is a global market. There are spaceports already in the world, all over the world, and there are more spaceports being developed. And for those spaceports to survive, they've got to be competitive. And I think Grant Shapps had the vision when we kicked off this process that the UK should have the most efficient regulatory system in the world. I think, as Josh has just said, right now it's a laggard from a timing and expense perspective. Now, that I just really want to be really clear. That's not saying the CAA is necessarily wrong. It's taking a different approach to risk, and maybe part of that is probably because the UK is a more difficult geographical place than, for example, Mojave in California and the Pacific.
Not Portugal, surely.
Well, I think you're going to have Dan Hart speaking later on today in the middle of his night on his birthday. But he was having to deal with Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal the night before. I mean, I went down to Cornwall the night before. He was having to talk to all those jurisdictions. It's not super simple launching out of it. Lots of things are really, really good about the UK, but that's one factor that could make it worse. But I think the big picture is the CAA is taking a different approach to risk and a bit to process and timing as well. And of course, it was the first time they did it, so there's always lessons to be learned and things to be improved next time. But I think unless there is, without wanting to be too dramatic, a seismic change in that approach, the UK is not going to be competitive from a launch perspective. And then you look at someone like Josh. I sit on his board. I sit on a few other space companies' boards now. Josh is doing a great job running his company, launching satellites. He also has to raise money. He's just raised money. I think it's, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 24 months of runway. A 6-month delay is a quarter of his money gone. And it's not, so it's real money that is burning every day you're late on launch. And of course, there are lots of factors that impact that. So Virgin Orbit in terms of being late and technical issues, but you don't want to overlay more risk on that to the extent you can. So obviously, a better decision is to minimise the risk on the regulatory side, and therefore, if Josh comes back to the board and says the next launch I want to do in the UK, he'll be given pretty short shrift in terms of whether that's a good idea or not, given all the other additional risks by investors. So the investors are incredibly all they care about. You can imagine what they care about, but successful launch as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible, is obviously vital to them. But there is no chance that Josh will win the argument to do the next launch from the UK. And I put it even further than that. Josh just talked about his costs of interacting with the CAA, the regulatory costs. I think this is a really important point. Were more than his launch costs. So even if the UK came back and said we'll do it for free, the launch, I would still say, Josh, you shouldn't do that, because the time, and more importantly, the risk around time, every month is 1/24th as Josh's life as a company with his current cash. you can't run the risk of additional delay through regulatory process. That doesn't mean it can't be sorted, but as I say, it needs some kind of big change from a risk appetite and process perspective. Otherwise, you're going to go to the US, where you can do it now, or Australia, Portugal, you've got Japan, you've got Brazil, you've got even Luxembourg. They'll all be looking at this going, how do we win this global game to become a great place to launch from? And there's lots of factors around that, legal insurance and all that kind of good stuff. But fundamentally, if you're not at the same level of risk appetite as those countries, you shouldn't be in that game. And as I say, that's not a right or wrong decision. That's just how it is.
So the ambition of the Secretary of State, and I might say modestly previous Secretaries of State, to be the first mover in this. We were had the first attempted launch, but the result of that is that you, as an investor in space, are saying that there's no chance of investors supporting another launch from the UK with the current regulatory.
Yeah, I mean, I think commercial business, unfortunately, is all around. They want certainty in terms of time and budget, because it all leads back to one thing, which is cash and cash burn, particularly if you're a startup. I mean, I said, and this was irrespective of whether Cornwall launch was a success or not, would have been exactly the same issue. I think for the UK to be able to launch again using commercial customers, it needs to have its next 1, 2 or 3 launch customers need to be government, i.e. people who are happy to take the risk that this could take quite a long time. And then UK can say, look, we're announcing in March, we're going to launch in September, and show it actually happens. And then in a year or two's time, Josh can come back and say, look, they've got a track record now, we can actually go with these people. But right now, there's just no way that Josh or any other board that I'd sit on would win the argument that they should.
This is a disaster, isn't it? That we attempted to show what we were capable of, and the result is that it's now toxic for privately funded launch. We now need to have the government do it to earn back the confidence of private space investors. Yes. And as I say, it's not saying the CA's got the wrong view, but they've got a different view. I mean, there are other things that have been positive, I'd say. I think the way I see it, launch, there's over 200 launch providers in the world. Launch is a really, really expensive thing to do. Virgin Orbit, it's public, has spent over $1 billion building it. So the good news is the UK hasn't gone and spent $1 billion building a launch capability. It's rented it off Virgin Orbit for, it's still a lot of money. It buys a hospital and stuff like that, but it's nothing like $1 billion. It's $10, $20 million. So they've taken a much more efficient route to get to space. However, if you want to repeat that, and we should probably come on to later, I'm sure we're going to talk about, why does the UK want to do launch? But if it wants to do launch, then it does need to change. Otherwise, it should focus on other as exciting and interesting things. There's lots of opportunity in space. This is, for me, about opportunity cost of money. You can spend it on launch, or you can spend it elsewhere in space or elsewhere in the UK economy. Maybe you want to talk about that later. So. We do want to talk about some of those issues, but let me turn to my colleagues, starting with Aaron Bell and then Tracy Crouch.
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify what you just said, Mr McCall, the implication is that the failure of the launch wasn't so bad. It was the delays that were worse for the sector. I mean, obviously, no one wants a failure, but failures happen in all jurisdictions.
I mean, I'll give you sort of an anecdotal example. As after the plane took off to launch, we had half an hour to go, and I was talking to everybody, saying, "Look, it was incredibly exciting at the time, and it was amazing." And then it all ended pretty quickly. But I spent that half an hour talking to lots of government officials, saying, "Look, we've got to get round the table and make this licensing process more efficient. Otherwise, it's not going to happen again." And so that was before launch decided it was success or failure. So that's a long way of answering your question. The answer is yes.
And the last answer you gave for the Chair teed up what I was going to ask, actually, which is, do you think the development of a UK launch capability is actually necessary for the success of the UK space sector? We have a lot of firms that operate and manufacture satellites and so on and so forth. Do we actually need that launch capability, or is it slightly massaging our own collective national ego?
I think it's more profound than that. I mean, the way I see why do you want? And I work with Virgin Orbit. I spent a lot of time going to Cornwall. I spent a lot of time with Spaceport Cornwall, who, by the way, did a fantastic job. Melissa, who you'll see later, and her team, very small team, did an amazing job. And what Cornwall Council has backed is incredible as well. For me, there are 2 reasons why you want to launch out of the UK. There's the rapid response military side. I'm not the right person to ask on that, albeit I am seeing, next military satellites are not being launched from the UK, so that begs a question on that. But there are different satellites at different times. And then for me, the most important thing is around how do you get the UK to understand the opportunity in space. So space is changing really, really quickly. What Josh is doing just literally wouldn't have been possible even 5 years ago. You can now, as opposed to 10 years ago when a satellite was the size of this room, unbelievably expensive to build, at probably $1 billion, payback period 30 years, launch cost absolutely astronomical. So, something had to live for 30 years to get your money back. You can now build a satellite for $100,000 and you can launch it for $100,000. The game has totally changed. And I think for me the most interesting, and I'm not technical, my background is an investment banker, what I think this is showing, and Josh is not technical either, he's doing a good job at learning it all, is there's so many applications for space. So whether you want to, the next, if it does happen from the UK, Kernosat, which is to look at seaweed development, everything from that through another company involved in called SatView, which can look at this building using infrared technology to work out whether you should be insulating it properly or not, and everything in between. The applications are amazing, and I think it's getting the UK public to understand that you don't need to be an astrophysics PhD. You can be as stupid as me, particularly from a technical perspective, and go, what's my application? I can look at biomass development in the developing world and work out where the next starvation issue is going to be because crops aren't developing, and identify that 6 months early. The applications and what is happening is just so amazing. And I think what happened on that night of that launch was both the excitement in Newquay, but also it was the lead story on BBC. Yep. There was live news, and I think everybody, it was a massive feel-good story, massaging you, but more importantly, I think everybody going, what does this mean for me? What could I do with this? And I think a lot of people would hopefully have gone home and said, I can set up a business around this. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me was, and kids at school, and I'm taking school kids down to Cornwall, and particularly kids that are struggling at school, they go, wow, this is incredible. I can do everything from establish a regulatory regime to make tractors drive in a straighter line and spread fertilizer. And so for me, it's a bit flippant to say it's sort of a marketing exercise, but and then it's getting people to move to Cornwall or move to Scotland or move to Wales, like Josh has done, and build those businesses using very, very bright people from all parts of society. Very exciting jobs, well-paid jobs, high growth, an exciting sector we're really good at.
The government obviously has an objective that we become a science superpower. We're investing more money in science generally, talking about education and the inspiration that this gives, and we've done an inquiry into STEM and inclusion in that as well. So if we don't develop launch capabilities, do you think that has a major effect on our overall ambition, which we've obviously got this new department as well, science, technology, innovation? Do you think that really says something about a lack of ambition if we can't deliver launch capability?
I think it really comes back to two things. Can Josh keep building his business outside the UK? Answer, yes. Can the other companies I'm involved in from a space perspective do launch out the UK? Absolutely they can. And then, without wanting to be too focused on it, money. This is costing money. You could decide tomorrow, we're actually not going to do this anymore. That frees up quite a lot of money. Yesterday, the UKSA, who's doing some fantastic work encouraging companies in the UK, announced it's 50 million for lunar type projects. That could have been 100 million if you don't do launch. I'm just pulling numbers out of space. But it's an opportunity cost of money, or you could go and build a hospital. And so that I think that's the way to look. Is this a good use of money? And I think the conclusion I've reached right now is not a good use of money, because our regulatory framework is not competitive. And again, I'll stress again, I'm not saying whether that's a right or a wrong view, but it's not competitive with the rest of the world. So a commercial company is going to go and these are not the US, Australia, Portugal. They're not sort of companies that are just winging it. It's not like Josh and I going, well, we're going to go somewhere that's a bit off the track, and we're going to grown-up countries with proper regulatory frameworks where it's cheaper and easier.
Can I just turn back to Mr. Weston briefly? At the risk of asking you to contradict your NED, but what would it take for you to launch again in the UK? What would you personally need to see as a CEO to launch again, whether it's in Cornwall or elsewhere in the UK?
So we've publicly said already that we would happily launch again from the UK. What we would need to see is progress in the regulatory environment, speeding up, lower barriers to um, overcoming some of those regulatory hurdles. And I think at the same time, the two things that also matter is confidence in the launch vehicle itself. So, if anything, apart from the failure it's suffered, I almost have more confidence now in a Virgin Orbit launch because they'll fix the problem and do it again. So we always say that we don't want to be anybody's first time, but really it's about establishing a firm cadence. So as Space Forge, we're launching one more mission this year. We're launching 3 more next year. One of those is already signed up again for a launch from the US. By 2026, we're looking at launching 12 platforms a year. At that sort of cadence, even half of them launching from the UK would provide a significant anchor customer for that. But where we need that support is in that regulatory environment, and the pricing that UK launch can achieve. Doesn't have to be as cheap as America. There are perks to not having to send a team out of 5 to Florida for 3 months. But the closer we can get to that, the better. And I think as well, as much as we could debate whether or not we pursue launch. I mean, we had that discussion as a country after Black Arrow. I think it really depends about what kind of global partner and science superpower the UK wants to be. It's not a question I can answer, but launch can make us a partner to other countries to work with in a science and in a space capacity that without launch we simply can't achieve.
Thank you. And just finally from me, you mentioned that Virgin Orbit will fix it next time. Are you satisfied with the technical explanations you've had as to the source of the anomaly and the reason the launch failed?
I mean, it's absolutely gutting that a component so small should cause that failure, but it's not without precedent either. It has already occurred in other launches, and I think in many ways I'm grateful to have suffered a failure like this so early on in our journey, and not with a much more capable, much larger platform with, quite frankly, much more money riding on it than we had. And if anything, I think the way that my team has responded to that, I mean, they took a day to grieve for the loss of that satellite. It was a lot of work, and then they were already heads down on the next mission. So we're coming back from it better. And I think as well as we can, and we still very much hold our heads high for having tried to attempt it.
Yeah, that's very good to hear. We all shared in your disappointment, but we look forward to seeing you launch again. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on that point, on the money, were you insured, or do your investors have to pay?
No, we took out insurance. I believe we were one of the only companies to do so. Our satellite on that launch was quite small. So it wasn't too onerous. It was maybe somewhere between £10,000 and £20,000 paid for across all of the different insurances. Our broker is very good. We've already received about 80% of our money back. However, the insurance does only cover the cost of the launch and the cost of the materials. It does not cover the resourcing, the engineering, or the time that we've lost from being involved.
And just to add on that, that's a really, really important point. It's multiples of the actual insured loss. The piece of kit is almost irrelevant from a cost perspective. It's time. It's the killer.
Especially in the race against other competitors that you described. Tracy Crouch and then Graham Stringer.
Josh, during our inquiry into the UK space sector, we urged the government to take steps to speed up the licensing process in order to get the launch sector up and running. We haven't had a response yet from government on these issues, but are you seeing any changes that you're content with, or do you still think that things need to be sped up, and do you think that the licensing process is fit for purpose?
I think the right questions are being asked, but the pace at which they're being asked is where really we're losing. What I would say again is that we're going through the licensing process on our Forgestar 1 platform. We started that, I think, in September of last year. Again, the engineering and technical teams of the CAA are doing some fantastic engagement, and we have noticed how open and responsive they are to our feedback around certain aspects of the licensing process. But I would have to be honest and say that I would not recommend a company go through their first license in the UK. It was quite painful at times. It was particularly onerous around company checks. So as a new entity, we understand the CAA need to be comfortable with we are who we say we are. But the checks reached a level of detail that I haven't seen, and I've gone through security vetting. And at times, we couldn't understand why that was not a separate process to the license of the satellite platform itself. And so being able to progress those as two separate tracks would be immensely helpful in helping other small space companies literally get off the ground.
Would you say from your interaction and engagement with the CAA that they're learning lessons from the process that you've had to go through?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has been a real acknowledgement of the almost the level of unneeded oversight on a company of our size. I mean, when we started 4*0 application process, I think we were around 25 people. By the time that process had concluded, we were 46 people. So we've already massively increased, and the company as a presence has changed significantly from the time that we submitted that original license.
Do you think they're appropriately resourced to meet the demands of the UK launch industry, particularly given obviously your insight into other authorities and their resources?
So I can't speak for launch, but from a satellite provider, no, they're not. They need more people. The way in which my understanding of the licensing process is, so our platform, once we get to our second generation 4*2 by around 2025, is a fairly standardized platform. So that element of the application should hopefully become relatively streamlined for us. However, the payload of each of those platforms has the opportunity to be different every time. We would need to file a brand new license for that payload each time there was a new one. That could be particularly slow, especially if we're in the usual kind of 12-month offering around that mission compared to some of these other regulatory kind of countries that I've mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Can I just
can I just make one point on that? I think staffing, before you talk about staffing, I think Josh touched on it. What's the inquiry that is needed? Can you lessen that, and then you work out how many people? So the idea of having more people doing what Josh is, I think, taking words out of your mouth there, Josh, too much work is unhelpful. So it's like reduce the workload and then resource it appropriately.
Okay, thank you. That is really helpful. And can I just seek clarification on something, please? Do you consider that the delays in licensing were the key reason that the launch didn't take place in the summer as planned? Or were there other reasons?
So there were certainly other, but it was definitely a key element of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine Fletcher wants to come in briefly, and then Graham Stringer.
Very briefly, the approach that the CIA are taking, are they taking it'll be fine and let's just identify a risk, known risks, like you're throwing radioactive material up in a satellite and we might need to know about that? Or are they going from a ground-up perspective where you have to tell them what it is and they work out that the plastic bits aren't dangerous? Can you just give us an idea of mentality?
Absolutely. So the CAA, from my perspective, they have a very sensible initial approach to risk. So they go for what's known as an ALARP approach, as low as reasonably possible. So I'm very pleased to say, spaceport, we don't deal with radioactive material because that's far too difficult. However, as low as reasonably possible is entirely subjective. So it could be subjective to the CAA, it could be subjective to the engineering or technical person in receipt of your license application. It's different between countries, it's different between even different regulators. So understanding at what level you provide at is different depending on who's reading your application. I hope that makes sense.
Right, okay, so there's an opportunity to provide upfront clarity to speed the process.
Thank you. Graham Stringer.
Just following on that question, Mr. McCall, I mean, you've given us pretty comprehensive answers to things. What I haven't got clear in my own mind is what you mean by appetite for risk. What are the risks that are being guarded against?
At the end of the day, space is difficult and it's risky. I mean, stuff can crash, blow up, land on people, land on ship. I mean, the night of the launch, there was a Spanish ship sailing in in the launch zone. It had to be moved with 10 minutes to go. It's a question, and it's probably more of a question of the CA, because I'm not involved intimately in the detail of this. But there just seems to be a lot. There's a lot more worry, is putting in sort of layman's my terms, in the UK about this than there is in other countries. So to give you an example, when I chaired Virgin Orbit, when you're a non-exec, you worry about the things that are most important. You can worry about 5 or 10 things, and then you let the exec team get on with it. Regulatory process was never on my list of things to worry about. It was just like, okay, here's a report, we don't need to talk about that, let's move on. Whereas for Space Forge, this was issue number one.
What I'm trying to get in my mind, you often hear at the start of a project, people are being over cautious, and it's costing us a lot of money, whether it's building a nuclear reactor or whatever. Costs are cut. Several years later, the thing blows up, there's an independent inquiry, and the costs shouldn't have been incurred. So that's one side of it. On the other side of it, jumbo jets, large aeroplanes, take off all the time. They don't land on ships in the ocean. They don't rarely blow up on the runway. So what is different about this that means that the CAA are taking a severe look at the risk involved? It's a 25-year-old jumbo jet that Virgin Atlantic flew across the Atlantic for many years, but it is modified, and there is a rocket on it, and it has, for want of a better word, ordnance on it, and it's got explosives on board. So there is risk, without a doubt. It's just a question of, you can't take everything to zero. What risk is you willing to take? It's worked in the US, which is not a helpful comment for me to make to the CA, because they have a legal obligation set out by Parliament to run a process. They can't just rely on the US. But it's a question, the kind of questions Josh was getting. I mean, Josh, you talked to me a few times about the fact that you were getting questions about your CCTV system in a small building in Cardiff. Is that the right level of detail to go to? And I know you're talking to Dan Hart later. I know that sort of he was frustrated, and I'm probably being a bit mean to Dan in terms of setting it up, in terms of the area that was looked at, from a physical area that was looked at from a risk perspective, is certainly more than he was used to in the US. So it's probably something to ask Dan about, who was Dan Hart, CEO of Virgin Orbit, in terms of he can compare and contrast in terms of what he's seeing in the US and what he's been asked for in other jurisdictions. Yeah, again, you've been very clear that the process should speed up. Josh has been clear that it should be less expensive with the comparators internationally, and it should change the basis of looking at risk. Are there any other recommendations you would make?
I think it's I think there's a lack of appreciation in terms of what matters to small companies like Spaceforge. That, I think for a lot of big companies, or if you work in the public sector, turning up for work and getting paid, it's just accepted that it's going to happen. If you're a small company, you're going, that's another day that I'm closer to running out of money, and also to raise money, you've got to be showing a positive view of life, and investors want time and they want certainty to budget and certainty to time when things are going to happen. So I think it's an appreciation, and this is, again, it's not a criticism of CA or UK say that the world's changed. This is not like dealing with Airbus, who are almost like a government organisation. The new space economy is around small companies that are startups that have limited financial resources and limited people. I mean, Josh has only got his office, his entire building, including manufacturing, is, I'd say, twice the size of this room. And I think the CAA is probably more used to sort of going into an Airbus or something like that, which has got multiples of this room all over the world, as opposed to the reality around what does new space involve. And all the companies I'm working with are 20, 30 employees with limited financial resources, and investors who understand the risks but need to understand. I mean, Josh, the questions he gets from investors at the board are, when's the next launch? Is it definitely going to happen? What are you going to show? When can we go and talk to the new lot of investors about raising more money to hire more people and create more jobs in the UK?
Final question. It's asking Aaron's question really in a slightly different way. What are the implications if we don't get this right for UK-based companies and for our international reputation in the world of space?
I mean, I think I'd sort of turn that around slightly and try and be positive. Space, what's happening in the space world, as I said earlier, is amazing. It's incredible what's happening, and it's literally going to change our lives and our children, where they're going to work and all that kind of good stuff. And what it's going to do, I saw Grant Shepps yesterday talking about net zero. Space is a huge enabler on that. It's incredibly exciting. The UK is one of the leaders on that, and it doesn't necessarily need launch to make that happen. Now, is it a bit awkward? Is it a bit difficult? Do I feel very sorry for people in Cornwall and Cornwall Council and all the people who've worked unbelievably hard to make that launch happen? It's very, very difficult. But the UK space industry can still survive and thrive without domestic launch. Personally, I think it'd be great if it could have launch, but it's not a must-have. It's a nice-to-have, but it's got to be a nice-to-have in an environment where we're competitive with other spaceports around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Stephen Metcalfe had a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned earlier about we might explore why the UK wants to be in space in the first place, and I don't think we've actually had that question directly to you, so I would be interested in why you think we should be there.
In launch or in the space industry?
In both, actually. I can more in launch, because actually I think we know why we want to be there.
Well, I think, yeah, we should definitely be in the space industry. I mean, I think it's one of the things that the UK excels at, and yeah, what Josh is doing, and there are lots of Joshes around the country right now doing similar, not quite as good as Josh, obviously, but doing similar stuff. And it is properly amazing. And going into his facility and talking to his team there, I mean, Josh has assembled 45 people, I think you said, Josh, in Cardiff to work on a satellite project. That's amazing. And he's doing it in an old garage in Cardiff. And these people are out there. And yeah, it's a very young team. It's a very diverse team. It's incredibly exciting. And that's happening all over the UK. And as I say, the output from that, what Josh is doing, we haven't really talked about what Josh is doing, making alloys in space that are going to be 50% more effective from an electricity usage requirements by making things in space and bringing them back to Earth. So he's talking to British Telecom, 1% of the UK's electricity consumption. He can make a massive difference there. So that's just one anecdotal example. Yes, we should definitely be doing space. Yes, the UK is really good at it. But for me, there are three elements. There's launch, there's building the kit, and then there's the applications. Do we have to do launch? No. Is launch very expensive? Is it very risky? Yes. Do we do satellites? Well, we're doing it already. We're actually really good at that, and that's happening across the UK. The really interesting bit for me is the applications, and that's where I think the UK needs to make sure that it's moving with the rest of the world. And right now, I think in a lot of places, it's ahead of a lot of the world. Maybe not America, maybe a couple of other countries, but we're a world leader on this. And I think for the UK to thrive in the future, it's really, really important. But as I keep on saying, launch, I think, is a very nice to have, but not a must have. And in the current construct, it's not a must have.
So the other two that you mentioned about satellite and application, they're not predicated on having the launch capacity.
No, I mean, if again, taking the extreme on that, if we had to have launch capability on the UK, from the UK, Josh should give up now, because it's not going to happen.
So do you think that the UK, we've talked about this for quite a number of years now, and about establishing launch capability. Do you think we actually want to do this? I mean, are we making it too difficult for ourselves? Is it in that pile of stuff that, it's a new area to regulate and actually it's a bit tricky, and let's make it as difficult possible for people like Josh so that they actually go elsewhere and then we don't have to deal with it?
I definitely don't think it's deliberate. I think people do want it, and I think the people I've met at the CA are very proud being involved in it and want to make it happen. And anybody who was in Cornwall, Melissa's here, but the atmosphere there was amazing. Just the excitement of making this happen and people being involved in it was incredible. But it's not working. And either we change that with the seismic shift, or we decide we're not going to do it, we save the money and we spend it on other things which are unbelievably exciting.
And final question, but where we are now just ain't working.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I thank Mr. Weston and Mr. McCall? I'm sorry, Mr. Weston, we didn't get the chance to ask you about your technology in more detail. We're very excited about that, but the question that we're looking into today is the regulatory arrangements, and you've been, both of you, very helpful in giving us the context for us to ask some further questions later this morning. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you in particular for joining us from Melbourne. I'm going to invite the next witnesses to come to the table, one virtually, and I will introduce them as they take their seat. So we have joining us from Los Angeles, Dan Hart, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Virgin Orbit. He previously spent 30 years at Boeing, where he was most recently Vice President of Government Satellite Systems. He's also worked on GPS, wideband global SATCOM, and the X-37 spaceplane. Thank you very much indeed for joining us either very late at night or very early in the morning. I think it's about 2 in the morning in LA, and it is your birthday, which is particularly good of you to interrupt it. And joining us, I'm pleased to say, at the table is Melissa Quinn, who is the Chief Executive of Spaceport Cornwall, and she is one of the first female spaceport leaders in the world, and an important recognition that we should give in a committee that wants to improve participation by women. Melissa previously worked for AeroHub Cornwall, which supported aerospace and space hub businesses. Very grateful to you both for coming. Melissa, as you were travelling up, you might have missed some of the praise that was heaped on you and your team in terms of the very hard work and commitment you made to the launch, which must have clearly been a great disappointment. Perhaps we can start with you and perhaps just describe, a few weeks on, what your recollection of the launch was, and any reflections to kind of kick off our questioning today.
Well, thank you for having me, and lovely to see everybody. Yeah, it's been quite a journey up to launch itself. I've been part of it since it started back in 2014 at Spaceport Cornwall. So it's been quite a roller coaster ride up to launch, which was just absolutely incredible and such a huge moment for my team, Cornwall, the country, and personally. We put so much energy into this, and anybody that works in the space industry, launch specifically, knows that the sacrifices that people make in it, including our families as well. So a lot culminated in that moment, and obviously it not going how we hoped it would was really disappointing for everybody, because we have put all that time and energy and passion and emotion into it. And I think you saw that probably on the night. My picture on the front page of a lot of papers crying was not something I expected. So yeah, of course it was disappointing, and I shared some time with Dan and his team, because they're just as passionate about what they do, and they're absolutely incredible with what they do and bringing launch to the UK. But since then, it's definitely been a lot of time to reflect, and the first reflection was we got to space. The first time ever from UK soil. That was huge, and remembering that we made that history happen from Cornwall, from a small regional airport after a pandemic, all the things that have happened was really inspirational. I think still, I should have brought them today, but I have thousands of letters from school children all across the country, all across the world, saying how inspirational it was. Most of them not even realizing that the satellites didn't get to where they need to be. They just absolutely loved it. So we're kind of building, the momentum back from a lot of those positives, and definitely, a step like today in looking at getting that second launch. That's hugely important to us as a spaceport. We're licensed, we're ready. We have that license, and that's something that we want to use, and we want to ensure that the UK use it as well, and that companies like Virgin Orbit want to use it. So for us, it's about how do we get to that point so that we can be the spaceport that we're just at the beginning of this, really, and I wouldn't want to lose it before it really gets started.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's very clear. Perhaps I can turn to Mr. Hart. We've obviously got the what went wrong with the launch itself, which was, I think, a dislodged fuel filter. Perhaps I might ask you to say something about that, update us as to what the latest thinking of that is. But you may have heard from our previous session that we've been advised not to get, as it were, too hung up on what tripped up the launch itself, but to try to learn lessons from some of the aspects of licensing and regulation that led to first delays and where we are at the moment, which is that we don't have a future pipeline. So could you reflect on both those things, the immediate problem and what led up to the launch?
Certainly. Well, let's see. Getting to the issue that we had, and we'll get into. A lot of things went right, as Melissa just mentioned. The issue that we had was a fuel filter apparently became dislodged and affected the fuel pump of our second stage. This was after the first stage had flown, and we were going on the order of 11,000 miles per hour when the second stage ignited. The fuel filter affecting the pump affected the operation of the second stage engine, which actually operated for quite a while, but eventually, because of heat buildup, had a failure, and that caused the system to turn off and continue along the trajectory which was planned in case of an issue, to be a safe trajectory, and it eventually fell into the ocean.
Thank you. And have you concluded those investigations, or is there some way to go before you definitively close the book on that?
We're well along the way. We have some experiments that we're doing. We're doing a very formal investigation, as you'd expect, with independent experts as well as government oversight. And so we're actually right now in the middle of doing some experiments to make sure that we can relate flight telemetry and data to ground test results and clinch it. In parallel, we are building or finishing the build of our next rocket, which actually has that filter designed out of it. But we want to make sure that we have our finger on exactly the issue and can share that.
Okay, thank you.
And your other question, as far as what the buildup, I would say number one is this was an enormous undertaking. We're a fairly small aerospace company, as aerospace companies go. It was an honor, frankly, to be in the position to attempt this first launch. And I thank Melissa and her team at Spaceport Cornwall, Ian Annette at UKSA, and Tim Johnson and the team at CAA, as well as the RAF and Air Vice Marshal Goddard or Godfrey and others who supported us. It was a hugely complex undertaking. The logistics aspect of performing the mission was quite a bit of undertaking, and then the safety aspects of planning and carefully planning and going through the regulatory. In terms of the regulatory environment, the first surprise that we probably got was, and Mr. Western sort of alluded to this, the ALARP process. We had anticipated that the FAA process would be sort of start off as the founding portion, and we could then use that documentation and analysis. And what we found relatively early on was that we would need to reformulate that in a unique UK regulatory set of documentation and analyses. So that was somewhat unexpected, and it would be helpful if the two were more compatible. Would be number one that I would point out. Number two is what we found was the CAA was involved, but there were many organizations that had a interest or a statutory requirement to have an interest in the launch, whether it was maritime or environmental or health and safety or others. There were nuclear and lots of organizations. And what we found was we needed to rehash information many times, and sometimes the asks would change in terms of the level of depth or the kinds of information that we needed. So there wasn't what I would call a central clearinghouse where, you're putting your information in and then the system is satisfied. And things changed along the way. And our expectations changed. We all plodded forward, but that was difficult. I mean, we were all taking a fair amount of risk of whether we were actually going to be able to do this, or whether the rules would change in such a way that we wouldn't be able to. Perhaps the largest example of that was, it was alluded to, I think, earlier, that the hazard area that was determined that needed to be established at the airport was a pretty late breaking development in the fall, I think, of last year, where it was determined that the hazard area that we had proposed was not adequate and we needed a larger one. That caused quite a burden on the airport to accommodate it, in closing roads and businesses and so forth. And then the last part that I'll mention at this piece is perhaps is the there was airspace to negotiate. There were things that there was range that needed to be evaluated, and there's perhaps a rethinking of what a company is capable of doing. I mean, we mustered through it, and eventually we usually ask for help, and often eventually we got it. And I'm grateful for that. But we can probably think forward the next time and think about, okay, if Virgin Orbit asks a ship to leave an area, it's probably not going to be as effective as if the Coast Guard does. And maybe we can set up those interfaces right from the get-go. Again, I would say it was a huge undertaking. My team had their heart and soul in this. We were tremendously disappointed that we didn't get to orbit. And most of all, I really apologize to the spacecraft that we didn't deliver.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Just to kind of follow up on the approach to regulation. I mean, was it the case that, for example, that the aircraft, the 747, needed to be licensed by the CAA, or this is a pretty familiar aircraft, was the FAA approval sufficient for this, or did it need to be specifically licensed?
It had to be sufficiently licensed. Specifically licensed, and there was interchange on both sides. We have an experimental certificate because it does have a special pylon, a rocket holder under the wing, and so it's the aircraft is under an experimental license, and so there was work to do there. I would say that probably wasn't the hardest part of it, although it was a risk that of working through the agencies and making sure everything would work out, and we got there.
Would you have expected there to have been a kind of a mutual recognition of the standards of a regulator of the the kind of the depth and experience of the FAA? Would you have expected more of a kind of passport system to apply, that if you approved in that jurisdiction, it could apply here?
That was our expectation. That we would need to, perhaps that we would take that as the foundation, and then we did expect that we would need to have lots of technical interchange. I mean, when we work with the FAA, we spend hours and hours discussing and talking with the engineers, and frankly, good questions come up. And to the CAA people, the engineers and the team, lots of good questions did come up, lots of good interchange. And when the engineers get together, I think answers actually happen quickly. I think there may be methodologies associated with that might improve things to have more of that interchange, so that when the documentation comes out, it's crystal clear to everybody what everything is. That's one way to be more efficient.
Thank you. Just before I turn to my colleagues, starting with Aaron Bell, of course there were multiple delays to the intended launch date, and at one point on the 9th of December 2022, Virgin Orbit put out a statement that the launch itself had to be put off because the licensors were outstanding, both for the launch itself and for the satellites within the payload. Do you recall the decision to postpone these launches being connected with those lack of regulatory licenses having been issued?
Well, I remember the delay. The reason also included needing to assure the health of the rocket, and we had an issue we were working also. And so what we found ourselves with was we were working a technical issue and working really hard to get it in before the end of December. When we looked at the windows that were allotted to us at that time, I believe there were 2 days that were approved for launch windows in December, and we didn't have our license yet. And so when you stacked all that together, it was not practical that we could, pull a rabbit out of the hat and get all of our work done and all of our certifications and have a window available to us when we needed it. So, I would not put that all on licensing, although licensing played a part.
So you were clear in your statement that it was some technical work that was required and the licensing. I was surprised, and I think our committee was surprised that when you made that statement, there was a very swift and robust response from the CAA, the regulator, saying that the delay in no way relates to the timing of a license being issued by the CAA. What you've just told the committee is that it was two things. It was a technical thing and it was a license issue. Were you surprised that you would get into that you would have a public, kind of tit for tat from a regulator like that?
I mean, there's some questions I think I would defer to the CAA there, but I think there was a lot of focus and desire to clarify. I would just say we are used to operating in an environment where we have several days and we have backup days to launch. And so, we're used to taking our time and, we have to make sure everything is right. And we always do before we go forward. And so therefore, looking forward and having a couple of days approved and maybe one or two more that might get approved, but we don't know that they will, was not a comfortable place for us to be. And honestly, that's one aspect that we would need to relook at going forward.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn to my colleagues, Aaron Bell, and then Stephen Metcalfe and Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. If I could turn back to you, Ms. Quinn, about the impact on Spaceport Cornwall. We saw the impact it had on you, and you've described the impact it had on your staff. What about the wider area and people of Newquay and so on? Has it affected the area that the launch failed?
I would say that if anything, it's had a more positive impact, especially from, as I said earlier, the kind of inspiration side of things. We've been out in the community a lot, talking about, picking yourself up, going again. This stuff happens in life, and that strong messaging, especially for young people, has been really important, and actually has brought a lot of more interest to what we're doing. There has been questions, obviously, with the major council investment into this, about what is the future of this, what does it mean, was it good value for money for Cornwall, and I would say 100%, if anything, from that inspiration side, but also the fact that we were in global newspapers all around the world. We've been inundated with space companies wanting to come and locate in Cornwall because of the launch. So from our perspective, I've just seen the positives. Of course, yes, local media have the headlines of it's failed, what a waste of money, and they're not seeing the wider picture of what we've achieved over the last 8 to 9 years leading up to the launch. And then since the launch, we're about to open a brand new building for satellite manufacturing and satellite data companies. That's full, and we haven't even opened it yet because of the interest on the back of the launch with Virgin. So I think looking at it beyond just the fact that, yes, the satellites unfortunately didn't get to orbit, but what it created was this catalytic effect and interest from media, school children, and businesses.
Thank you. I mean, you're obviously, from what you've just said, you're engaged with the local community, speaking to schools and so on and so forth. Do you think the people in the area understand the benefits it can bring to the area, as well as obviously the excitement, but the commercial benefits and the benefits for the economy of the area as a whole?
We've done such a lot of work over the last few years on community engagements. It's been fundamental because I think, and I was over in America last week at the Global Spaceport Alliance. So all the spaceports in the world get together once a year. And I was asked to speak and tell our story. And the one thing I said that I think all the spaceports anywhere have to do is properly engage with their community, because the community and local politicians, local media have the ability to shut these projects down. And you can see cases of those all around the world. What has been successful for us is that engagement with the community, going out and understanding what their concerns are, but also where the opportunities are. So when it came to launch on the night, we were allowed 2,500 people on site. Eventbrite said we could have at least had about the interest that they had in one day at 10,000 people from the local area. We were, again, inundated with local communities wanting to be part of it, local businesses that have nothing to do with space, being part of it and benefiting from it. So I think that the general consensus across the board, I would say, in the community is, yeah, this was really exciting. When are you going again? How can we get involved? Definitely.
Thank you. That's very good to hear. And if I know colleagues want to ask about the future activities from Spaceport Cornwall, so I won't tread on their toes, but can I ask what joint lessons learned activities you've carried out together with Virgin Orbit? I'll come to you in a minute, Mr. Hart, same question, but also with the UK Space Agency and the Civil Aviation Authority. What joint lessons learned activities have you had since the failed launch?
We've had a few different ones. We had the CAA come down and just speak just with us and our ops team at the airport, which was really useful. More unofficially, what do you think? How should we move forward with this? Dan's team only just left properly a couple of weeks ago, so we had them still on site for a long period of time. So again, working with them more unofficially than anything official. And then this afternoon we're sitting down with UK Space Agency and the government to discuss a more formal lessons learned, and I imagine that will continue going forward. But we have yet to have a wide joined up lessons learned with Virgin Orbit, with CAA, with UK Space Agency and with ourselves, and I would definitely appreciate having something like that in the near future.
Thank you. Yes, if I could turn to you, Mr. Hart, as well. Obviously, you've had to do the technical investigation yourselves, but what joint working have you done on lessons learned, and what lessons have you learned so far?
Well, we, as Melissa just mentioned, there's a meeting this afternoon that I think is the start of lessons learned. So there really has not been a lot of interaction yet. I think as Patrick McCall said before, there's a bit of a seismic shift that we ought to think about on how, what is the core, what is being protected, and what is the most efficient way to get there, and then what are the risk levels. And so I'm anxious to get into some of that discussion, and I think that could be very fruitful.
Thank you. And the specific source of failure, the fuel filter, there's a long tradition, tradition is probably not the right word, but a long history in the space industry that it's often the little things that people hadn't thought of. What extra measures will you take in future to ensure that all of these little components are fit for purpose at launch?
Yeah, there is a very, very involved process in place already on many hundreds and thousands of components. We're looking at filters as well as any kind of installation, practices that may need to be changed. Again, we're not sure if it's an installation aspect or if there's something associated with a fluid dynamics situation. We're doing experiments right now, so it's a little bit early yet for me to put a pin on all of it, but we will look very broadly at the causes, the contributors, and then we'll attack every single one.
Sounds like rocket science.
Yes. Just finally on that point as well, the checks that you did do before the launch, should they have picked up this failing, or is it a case that need to be further checks? You're not able to say yet.
It's not. They would not have picked up, and there were significant checks. There are some things on the ground that you don't quite replicate in your ground from flight. The G forces, some of the vibration effects. aerodynamics. So you do test, and we did test this area for leaks and for lots of things. The robustness of the design and installation just need to be there, and that's what we're going to make sure of.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hutt.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Metcalfe, then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Just a quick question. For absolute clarity, will you be pursuing another launch from Cornwall? And if so, when do you think that will be?
Yes, we have had some discussions. It's unclear at this point. A launch starts with the payload and the satellite, and so there are options there. As Mr. McCall mentioned, there are government satellites that are candidates. There are commercial satellites that are candidates. There also are some ideas about university satellites to spur education. So there's a lot can be done there, but it starts there. The regulatory framework really does need to be looked at, and hopefully we can work together to improve the process. And I'd say, those are the two pieces, and then we would. My team looks at me and says, "When are we going to finish this?"
Okay.
In other words, let's get to orbit.
Great. But in terms of timescales for that, all those things, I recognise you need a payload and you need to get licenses in place. But when do you think the next attempt will be?
I mean, we could do it before the end of the year. I don't have confidence that the other pieces will be ready by then. And so I think it's a great question, but it really has to get to A, a payload, and B, how long does it take to really look at the regulatory side and plan another mission.
Okay, so an aspiration, not a plan. Perfect.
Yes, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, and happy birthday. You mentioned that the regulatory framework needs to be looked at. Very briefly, can you let us know what the advantages and the disadvantages of Virgin Orbit launching from the UK are compared to its other launch options?
Well, I think the advantages really for us have to do with engagement and participation in a growing UK space sector. And that sector really spans commercial, civil, and national security. And so the advantages for us is to be a partner and a trusted provider of space launch. The technology that we've developed is very unique in that we can take a slab of cement at an airport, and the next thing you know, a week later, there's a spaceport there. And I, with a lot of help from Spaceport Cornwall, mind you, but that is very unique. The other aspect is, we can fly out and put the rocket where it wants to be before it ignites. And obviously there's a lot of neighbors and a lot of airspace around the UK. And so having that flexibility, we could fly north and do northerly trajectories. We could fly further out and do various trajectories from the south. That's quite a bit different than if you were sitting on the ground at one launch pad. And the last part is, we got off on a blustery, rainy night in Cornwall, which there are many. There happened to be one here in California tonight too. But a ground launch rocket would not have launched that day. And so I'm very proud of the team. I'm very proud of the technology we developed and our pilots for being able to navigate that and on the first opportunity to get off in a new spaceport and a new place. So, for us, it's being a part of the community and part of the industry and the economy and the national security requirements. And I think we're uniquely capable of doing it.
I should just point out that the Member of Parliament for Newquay was in the committee room earlier, and he would hotly deny that there are many blustery nights in Cornwall. I think they're exceedingly rare. But Rebecca.
On the issue of the regulatory framework, very briefly, what do you think needs to be looked at? What changes would you like to see the UK government make?
Well, so let me start with the I'll say the symptom, and then the question is, what drives it. We found ourselves in a position where we were, the hazard area, as I mentioned, at the airport was very high and impactful to the airport and to the spaceport Cornwall, and it cost a lot of money there, and it reduced our flexibility. The other thing is the amount of airspace that was determined to be hazard areas was much more than we were used to. When we fly past San Diego and we fly past Mexico, the hazard areas are more tuned towards where there are events like a staging event on a rocket or something like that. And so why is that? I think it would be useful to really look at what are the requirements. The hazard area at the airport, I'm not a safety analyst by trade, but I know it was developed assuming that 100% of the fuel and oxygen could instantly combine and ignite, and that's an enormously conservative assumption. Usually, what I've seen is less than 20% is assumed in hazard analyses on ranges. So I think some of those would be important. The other important things are just roles and responsibilities in having a central clearinghouse where, there's a central regulatory framework, so we don't have to negotiate with individual agencies. It was an enormous amount of work to get everybody together.
Thanks, Dan. And Melissa, is work underway at the moment to secure further launch partners?
Yes, obviously our anchor tenant being Virgin Orbit, but we've always been very clear that we want to be a multi-user spaceport. The beauty of our spaceport is we're an active civilian airport at the same time, so we're about integrating into the activities at the airport, which means that we're not just about launch on the site, which makes the whole business model a bit more sustainable in the sense that it's not all eggs in one basket. So for us, it's about the quality over the quantity of launches at Spaceport Cornwall to make the business model work. And that's why attracting other businesses, whether they're space or aerospace, to the site off the back of the launch is really important, because when Virgin are not here, we want to be using the facilities and making sure that we're making good on all the investment that's gone into the site. And so we have announced a partnership with another launch operator called Sierra Space, with Dream Chaser, and they take off vertically, likely in the States, and they'll land. They need a landing along runway, and so we're working on a concept of operations with them. We have Space Engine Systems, a Canadian launch company that's just relocated over from Canada, that's just set up about a month ago, and we have a couple of other launch operators. But that being said, with horizontal launch, there's not a lot of players in the game, and so the fact that we're, our anchor tenant being Virgin Orbit, who is the premier of and the main launch operator globally for horizontal launch, is a huge coup for the UK. As I said, I was just over at Cape Canaveral, and US Space Force were talking to the whole conference about using allied spaceports around the world for national security. The only non-US spaceport they put up on their map was Spaceport Cornwall. The importance of maintaining this capability for the UK, and I understand what Patrick was getting at earlier, saying launch, we don't need it. I think as the way the world is going, if we don't have our own access to space from the UK when we are building these incredible satellites for national security, but yet we might not be able to replace them, I think that leaves us out in the cold. And I guess for me, I know the regulations have been difficult. Believe me, from a spaceport perspective, we understand, but they have been difficult for everybody, and I think this is our chance now to get it right, because saying that we don't need a launch capability, I think, would be the wrong decision. Not just from creating a market opportunity for the US, making sure that these satellites can launch from home soil, but also from a national security perspective. So for me, that is fundamental that we, yes, of course, make sure that we're supporting companies like Virgin Orbit to launch, but also future companies as well. And by creating that one, spaceport that we have licensed already here now, and making sure that we're backing it, and it is a national asset. It's not just Cornwall Council and Virgin Orbit. It's a national asset that I hope the UK want to use for all those different reasons I just mentioned.
Thank you. And very briefly, I understand that you might not be able to disclose too much information on this point because it might be commercially sensitive, but you mentioned that Virgin Orbit is your anchor tenant. Are there any potential restrictions that would restrict you from securing future arrangements with future operators?
No, the decision by Cornwall Council to invest in the spaceport back in 2019 supported a Pathfinder launch with Virgin Orbit, and that's why you saw the investment going into the site and into Virgin Orbit, was we wanted to create that capability. We don't have it here. So for us, that initial pot of funding was really important and crucial that we, proved that capability. And then I think, sorry, what's the question? Remind me of the question.
Is there anything that would restrict you from going securing future partners, essentially?
No, as long as for us, again, that we know when they're coming back to launch that they have access to the facilities when they need them. That, of course, will have a priority over the next few years, definitely. But there's nothing in contractually saying that we can't work with other people.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on that, I mean, would any payments be triggered to Virgin if you did host another launch from another company?
Our commercial agreement is for the first launch only, and we'll be negotiating what the future agreement looks like after that first launch.
So in the case of Virgin, so the anchor tenancy was for that launch?
For that launch, yes.
And that's expired now?
At the end of February, yeah, it expired.
At the end, at the end of February, then there is no anchor tenant at the moment. It's a kind of, to excuse the expression, it's a Virgin site.
No, we have other people coming in now to use the facilities.
But they can, but it's back entirely in your control. You've got no contractual commitments, put another way, no contractual engagements from any other launch company.
Nothing contractual, just MOUs.
I see. Okay. Catherine Fletcher wanted to come in with something.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Hart, I did notice you just raised your hand at the end of that question. So do you want to just come back in before I go off? Yeah.
Yes, if I could. I thought Melissa brought up a very important point, and I just want to emphasize it. It has to do with the importance of space launch in the future. Space assets have become and will be more of the fundamental infrastructure that are supporting the UK's economy, understanding of the environment, and national security. If you play it back 20 years and how space was used, and you play it to now, you see tremendous changes. I mean, we know what's going on in the Ukraine because of space assets. We look at it in the evening news every day. We look at imagery. We weren't doing that 20 years ago. We communicate with space. We're going to manufacture in space, as Josh Western mentioned before. So it really is a part of, and will be more and more a part of, the infrastructure supporting us. And that is why it's really an important piece. And if you play it forward 10 years, if something blinks out, or there's a disaster or a situation that requires a space asset, it will become more and more important to get something in the right place at the right time.
Really?
And I think that is the point. And I just wanted to agree with Melissa. I couldn't agree with her more.
That's beautifully put, and probably brings me back to where I'm coming from. Is, let's say I 100% agree with you, although I'll hold my right to reserve my right to change my mind. But if that's the case, let's get this right. So you mentioned the idea of maybe having a central regulatory framework and preventing dealing with multiple agencies. At the risk of testing your memory, could you give us a flavour of who they are? You've got the CAA, you've got the FAA, I presume you've got local council planning. Have you got the Environment Agency? Could you just give us an idea of what the UK local and national government regulatory framework looks like as a user of it?
I can somewhat, and I could get you a better list. And you rattled off some of them there. But yes, the CAA on the space side, the CAA on the aircraft side, the maritime community. I think there are a couple of different communities there. There's the environmental community. There's health and safety, both at the federal and as well as the local level. And then there's airspace, and there's international airspace. And so, there's a enormous, I would say, well over a dozen, maybe a couple of dozen different communities that we had to brief and get comfortable. Eventually, the statutory review required nuclear and other communities also get.
I tell you what, it would be wonderful to get the long list on the record, and I'm conscious of time, but if you could write to the committee, I'd be very grateful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And just one final question for me, if I may. You're a global company. You've got agreements, arrangements in place, not just with the UK, but with Japan, with Poland, with Brazil, with Australia, with Luxembourg, obviously the US. We've heard from our evidence today how attractive it is for countries to host launch, partly to help their own space and satellite industry, but partly to generate some public excitement around it. You're pretty footloose. Are you not going to increasingly expect to go to places in which the local jurisdiction, national governments and local governments, make it worth your while? In other words, pay your costs.
Yes, we're a business, and so we only survive through our economic value that we can bring to our shareholders. So yes.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your evidence today. That is extremely helpful to have. We're now going to ask the UK regulators to come and join us at the table. So as we do that, I will introduce them. And we have, very pleased to say, Sir Stephen Hillier, who is the chair of the Civil Aviation Authority, took over the chair in August 2020. Sir Stephen's had a very illustrious career in the Royal Air Force before that, becoming Chief of the Air Staff. He's got extensive military flying experience, as you would expect, and we're very grateful to him for coming today. And we'd like to welcome back Tim Johnson, who is the Policy Director for the CAA, helped us with the inquiry to which this is a follow-on response. And we also have Ian Annett, who is from the UK Space Agency, joined the agency in 2020 as Deputy CEO for Programme Delivery, and he's responsible for the delivery of all national space programmes across the agency, including the space flight programme. Thank you very much indeed. You've been kind enough to sit through the evidence that we've had from other witnesses, and so the questions that we have won't surprise you, because they are in effect the questions that they have put to us. And I guess it amounts to this. We've recognised in this country, through the government and other agencies, an opportunity that we want to take to have satellite launch, have space launch in this country. We've got a very strong satellite industry. We wanted to have a first mover advantage in this, at least in Europe, and we had that through the Cornwall space launch. But what we heard, especially in the first panel, is that we've thrown that away, and that now commercial investors will positively not invest, or the assessment is they're unlikely to invest in the UK, and the whole thing needs to be rebooted with public sector customers to re-establish our reputation because of the regulatory approach that's been taken. So, Stephen, what's your response to that?
Well, Chair, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for this opportunity. And if I could just start to answer that question by saying, from a Civil Aviation Authority perspective, we see we've got two roles. We are the regulator. We also see we have a role to play in enabling successful aerospace enterprise, so both aviation and in space. Clearly, we have a statutory duty in relation to regulation, but in terms of enablement, then we are very active in trying to play our part in enabling a thriving aerospace and in this case, space environment. So we play in both of those roles. In terms of what we've heard already today in the situation that we are in, then clearly there were lots of positive comments there, and there's lots of emphasis as well on lessons identified, and we are absolutely a learning organisation, and we want to play our part to the full in that. So really participating in that process at the moment. We have a key role to play, and as has already been covered, work to do even with the next couple of days as we start to bring all of that together. So there's lots of great points have come out there. But what I need to come back to is what is that core role that the CAA was performing is to enact the legislation which was given to us, and that our primary duty is to ensure that the space activity in the UK is conducted safely. It's conducted within the ALARP principle, which I have to say is as low as reasonably practicable. One of the earlier witnesses said possible. And there's a really significant difference between possible and practicable, but it's practicable. And it relies on things like safety cases, etc. So that is the foundation of the work that we have been doing. The final thing I'll just say is that, to be honest, I don't think there's been enough balance so far on technical readiness. And that was the thing which was very much focus of the CAA, certainly in the second period of last year. The previous Virgin Orbital launch was on the 2nd of July 22 in Mojave Desert. The average for Virgin Orbital launches is about 6 months between launches. So it was always going to take a period of time for them to reconstitute, certainly in another country, in a new operation, and then actually deliver the mission. And in terms of how the sequencing worked, the CAA licensed. From our perspective, we are confident that we licensed in advance of technical readiness. And so you mentioned, Chair, that exchange of correspondence last year. It is very unusual for the CAA to go public and make a regulatory statement to the stock exchange and say, it's not the licensing, it's not down to us. It's a very unusual step, and we would not take that sort of step lightly. So as far as we're concerned, we licensed in December and the launch happened in January, and there were technical issues which were running through there. Perhaps I'll just pause there, Chair.
Well, indeed, you say there were some positive things said, and your engineers were singled out for particular praise in that, and that certainly needs to be acknowledged. But net, the evidence that we've heard, not just from Spaceforge, but from Virgin Orbit, is the most devastating evidence I've heard on a commercial regulatory context since I've been chairing this committee. Something that was a strategic priority for this country to be ahead of the world. We've heard evidence from investors and operators to say that their experience of regulation here has put us behind the rest of the world. So I don't think it can be, one could hide behind the excellence of the engineers that you employ. There is clearly a big problem with the approach to regulation in the eyes of those who deal with jurisdictions right across the world and are going to go to them in the future rather than the UK. And are warning publicly others not to come to the UK. That is, as the chair of the regulator, not something that you can be comfortable with, I would submit.
In terms of where people have criticised us for our engagement, and absolutely, then we recognise what they say, but I'd look at it from the perspective of the Civil Aviation Authority took on this role in July of 2021. I ran through from the CAA board perspective, and in that period we've had 18 board meetings from then until now. At a dozen of those board meetings, space and our progress with space was a substantive matter for discussion and debate, including an extraordinary board meeting in advance of the Virgin Orbital launch. I have to say that is greater than the application that we've applied to virtually any other area of our business. In terms of engagement, I know that, Tim Johnson will cover this shortly, 6 separate visits to Virgin Orbital in the Mojave Desert and countless other engagements that we have done across the process. In terms of wider sector, yes, there was the licensing associated with Virgin Orbital, but not getting as much publicity as it should, frankly, is that the CAA has issued so far, in the last 18 months or so, 285 space licenses. 12 of them were related to the Virgin Orbital license, but the other 273 of them were more widely. On the very day that, disappointingly, and the CAA absolutely shares the disappointment that this launch was not a success. As I say, we feel we have a key role to play here. We feel this as well. But on that day, 40 other CAA licensed satellites went into orbit. So in terms of the focus that we give this, absolutely. And I know that the committee looked at its last meeting at the size of our space team, 35 at the time. It's nearly 50 now, and it's growing all the time. And the reason it is growing is because we are investing the resources from a CAA perspective to ensure that we have match the capacity needed as the industry continues to develop in the UK. And if I look at it from a personal perspective, I have engaged at least twice with every constituency MP in potential spaceports around the UK. I have written to them as well. I have engaged with the sector myself, and clearly I know a lot of the players from my previous roles as well. And I would say that proportionally, this has been a huge investment from the CAA. We've got it here, and I feel that we're playing our part in that.
I mean, you take us back to the inquiry that the committee conducted, and it was before the launch, and we took a lot of evidence, including from Mr. Johnson, and what we heard, we take our evidence from witnesses either appearing in person or many more who write to us, and the conclusions that we came to, which was to be worried about whether the CAA was the right body to be entrusted with this regulation. Previously, space had been under the UK Space Agency. We heard from others, including some of the Scottish spaceports, that they were concerned about delays and uncertainty in regulation. We heard worries about the capacity, the numerical capacity of the team. We heard worries about the duplication or the creation of different standards. We reported all that in terms of recommendations. They weren't taken up either by the CEA or the government, frankly. And then what we've had in the context of the failed launch in Cornwall, which I think it's clear is not about the technical fault, but it has given the opportunity to look back. And I can't see that any one of those recommendations was off beam, and yet, Mr. Johnson, you rebutted them at the time when we were forming them. You said that you had the right number of people, that you were the right organisation, that you were operating in an agile way. Do you reflect back that actually that was the wrong steer to give the committee?
As Stephen has outlined, we increased the size of the team during the course of the year to reflect the workload. So we did sort of hear what you say and reflected on it. Throughout the year, we did make substantive progress, but we also learnt lessons along the way. So I can think of a number of areas where, working with some of the operators, we adjusted our engagement plan. We upped the frequency of our rates. We were talking to Virgin Spaceport Cornwall in a number of different guises, at least 2 to 3 times a week. We amended, for example, our approach to the environmental assessment, having had some initial feedback from Spaceport Cornwall and Virgin on the approach there. As Stephen said, we're a learning organisation. There's a lessons learnt process across all the parties going on. At the moment, we've already identified a number of aspects of our something called our regulators' rules, which deal with some of the points I think that Spaceforge made at the outset. Some of the other changes that we might want to think about relate to legislation, whether that be sort of set out in the secondary or primary legislation.
When it comes to some of the detail of the approaches, Mr. Stephen, you've had a brilliant career in the RAF. You've been used to dealing with the armed forces, particularly the air forces of other countries. Military-to-military cooperation is something that I'm sure you practiced every day during the height of your military career. Why is it the case, as we've heard repeatedly today, that the standards and the licensing of a respected an organisation as the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA, is not passported and respected here, that you taking an approach at the CAA revisit it all and start from a blank sheet of paper? Why? Surely you could bring from your previous career a recognition of the good work that's done by trusted allies.
Well, I mean, just referring to that previous career, then it is the case that sometimes, on occasion, we do mutual recognition, as we would call it, and other times we don't. The UK has its own specific requirements, so that exists in defence as much as it does in civil aerospace. In terms of our relationship with the FAA, it's an excellent relationship at all levels, and as you may be aware, we even have an FAA secondee in our space team to make sure that we transfer as much of those lessons as possible, and we have enormous respect for what the US system has achieved over 6+ decades of space launch capability. Why don't we just passport it in? Well, to be honest, that's not what the legislation says. The legislation says that the UK has its approach, and that includes things which are like the ALARP principle and the building of safety cases. And the whole emphasis in the UK system is it's not for us, the regulator, to tell the entity how to be safe. It is for them to build the safety case and say, here's why they think it is safe. And then we describe the regulatory framework and we do the assurance within that. It's a different approach to regulation. Now, whether that's right or whether that's wrong, but our duty as the Civil Aviation Authority is to enact the legislation which requires us to do these things.
Clearly, we've heard that things have gone wrong in the sense that we've fallen behind other countries, and we heard evidence that Australia and Portugal, for example, are taking an approach that is more accommodating of work that's been done by the FAA in particular. So are you saying that you're prevented by the legislation from doing that? And is it right that this committee should take a recommendation from you that the legislation needs to change because you're being hemmed in by it?
I don't think the statutes need to change. We are working, as I say, very closely with the FAA, and I do believe there are areas where we can do mutual recognition at a particular level, consistent with the legislation that we have currently in the UK. But we have to respect things like the geography. I mean, the CAA's primary role is to ensure the safety of this activity, and that's the safety of the general public on the ground who might be affected by this launch activity. And there is the obvious difference between launching from the Mojave Desert and going out over the Pacific over a single nation's airspace, or launching from Australia, again, single nation's airspace and sparsely populated area. There's a world of difference between that and somewhere like Newquay and Cornwall, where there is clearly a lot of population around. I mean, we previously heard from Spaceport Cornwall, 2,500 people there watching this launch activity actually happening. That doesn't happen in the Mojave Desert. And then going out into an international airspace and having to negotiate with a whole range of other nations for this launch activity. So we have very specific things from a UK perspective. There is a UK approach, which is we are responsible for the safety philosophy, if you like, within our national boundaries, and this is the approach that we have decided to take.
I understand that, and clearly the Mojave Desert and indeed Australia are different environments. But Portugal and Luxembourg, these are places that have comparable challenges. And surely it's concerning to hear that the jurisdictions in Portugal and Luxembourg, for heaven's sake, landlocked countries, quite small, are able to adopt more of the licensing arrangements from the FAA, and that we're losing out to them, and we're taking an exceptionalist approach, even compared to those two European Union countries.
I'm not familiar with the Luxembourg approach, but what I would say is they haven't done a launch, so we will need to wait and see how they work that through the EASA system and with the European Air Safety Agency system. So we'll need to see. And in terms of Portugal, that's not, as was covered, a launch capability. That's a recovery from a satellite which is coming in over the Atlantic Ocean. you can imagine the difficulty of landing something in a part of sea space around the United Kingdom and the challenges that would bring. But I don't want to come across as we have the perfect solution. Not at all. We are a learning organisation. This was the first UK space launch. We have colleagues in the US who have got over 60 years of this experience. This was our first one. We are learning and improving all of the time. In terms of timescales, how long will this take? We identified and we publish that for a first license should be between 9 and 18 months for that to work through. That's not just taking a swag. That is calculated on the experience of other safety critical industries, oil, gas and the like, plus our own experience as the CAA. And we published that. And that was published in, I think, 2019, before the CAA even took on this responsibility.
What about the approach of implementing that? We heard that you can make one application only and then that's it, rather than being able to iterate it and work it up, as it were.
I'll pass that to Tim in a moment, but if I just say that the Virgin Orbital license within that 9 to 18 month window was done in 10 months. So we did it right at the left-hand end of what we said we would do. Now that doesn't mean that every subsequent license or application is 9 to 18 months. We build on the experience that we've already got, and it will depend. If there was another application. Or we notified another launch out of spaceport Cornwall, then we'd say, well, is it the same as you did before? It's going to be a relatively straightforward process. If it's markedly different, then, well, there's more work to be done. And it's not necessarily a 9 to 18 month process for every satellite. Again, we use proportional regulation here. We don't just sort of say, here's a blank a template and applies in every circumstance. We analyse risk. We look at the mitigations and we work with those that we're licensing. But Tim, do you want
to... on this point, obviously there are lessons to be learned, and we've heard that a kind of a single application needing to be made without the ability to iterate it has been constraining. Is that something you can change?
So the spaceport and the launch licenses that we have issued are not just for one launch; they are for Virgin and for Spaceport Cornwall. They allow two launches a year. So they're in place. If either Spaceport Cornwall or Virgin want to fly a slightly different trajectory, there would be a process involved in amending the licence, but it is certainly not going back to sort of first principles and applying for a whole new licence. That's one, I think, the advantages of the UK regime, that we, for launch...
The point that we heard was on the way to getting the first licence, that there was a sense that they had to submit everything and then wait and hope for the best, rather than, as it were, working up the content to be able to get to an approval and have that kind of iterative relationship.
I think from our perspective, we had a very iterative relationship, both with Virgin Orbit and Spaceport Cornwall. We went over regularly to see them. We had multiple meetings most weeks of the year where they were submitting evidence. We were assessing it. We were asking some questions. We were testing and probing it. So, as Stephen said, we're a learning organisation. I think we adapted a lot of our engagement throughout the course of last year and how we went about that. But I sort of, in preparation for this committee hearing, went back and looked at the amount of engagement we did with all of the applicants, and it was very considerable.
Okay. Let me turn to my colleagues. Stephen Metcalfe wanted to come in with a supplementary.
Yes,
then
thank you. Good morning, everyone. So, Stephen, you talked about the regulatory framework being laid down in statute. Mm-hmm. So, do you have any degree of flexibility in the way you interpret that statute? And the second part of that question is, when deciding how to interpret it, what process do you go through? Because obviously everything can't be covered through legislation. You have to decide what to do.
Absolutely. It's not a case of, and we would never want it to be the case, that in statute it describes everything that you must do, because ultimately, if we could, I don't know, write a formula or an algorithm and you just put in the variables and out come the answer, then you wouldn't need people involved. There has to be judgment in there. And probably the primary judgment is around as low as reasonably practicable. Now, the approach to as low as reasonably practicable, from my perspective, is you make every effort to gather the evidence and the data that is reasonably you're able to access, that you examine every risk and you work it through to a reasonable conclusion. And at the end of all of that, you can be satisfied that you've got all of the data inputs, if you like, and then you apply the judgment. The risk is that if you apply the judgment too early in the process, and you say, well, yeah, I'm sure this is going to be okay, well, a lot of the times that might be fine. But when it's not fine, then you'll subsequently go back and regret it. Now, as was covered by previous witnesses, this space launch is a complex and demanding activity. There are multiple factors that you need to look at, so it takes time to go through that exercise. But as I say, we need to take it to a reasonable conclusion. If we just waited till the point where we had absolute certainty, then we wouldn't be doing it as low as reasonably practical. So that's the way we approach it. How does that work through in practice? Is we have an excellent space team in the CAA. They build up all the evidence. They come to their judgments, and then we have additional layers who oversee their work, and ultimately there is a single accountable individual in the CAA who are responsible for signing off and saying, I'm satisfied the evidence is there, here are the judgments that I have made. And then ultimately within the CAA as a whole, the board does not make that safety-based decision because it rests with accountable individuals, but the board makes sure that the CAA's work has been done well and that the decisions that have been made appear reasonable to them as well. Okay. So that's how we work it through.
Fine, thank you. That's very clear. So what I don't want to do is, we heard mention earlier of a CCTV camera in a factory needing to be assessed as part of this process. But what you're saying is there must be a reason for that. Can you speculate as to what that reason would be? Or do you think that's an overburdened, somewhere in the middle, either it's overburdensome regulation or there is a really good sensible reason for that we don't know?
Yeah. So I think the point was made in relation to national security clearances. That is part of the process which is set down. And I know there was a question about what are all the agencies who have to be involved. Well, we have that list if you want to go through it. I think that in those sorts of areas, absolutely, this is where we need to do lessons identified and say, is it proportional what is being done in that security risk assessment? I'm not making a judgment what the outcome would be, but we need to analyse that. I think that those sort of areas, consultation, that's a significant part of the timelines involved here. How and with whom we can consult. Those are things we can work on. There are a number of areas. What I would be very reluctant to do is to say that we start to compromise on the safety-based issues because these things go wrong. I mean, across space operators, space launch overall, the success rate, particularly in the early stages, is actually quite low. Things do go wrong. And we are accountable as a CAA for making sure that when they do go wrong, they go wrong, if you like, in a safe way that doesn't affect people on the ground and cause risk to life. So, but that's the core, if you like. Around the outer, I think there's much work to be done, and that's why I'm really looking forward to this lessons identified process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. So, Stephen, I don't have your bravery or your background in terms of your military career and history, but what I was doing before I came into this place was trying to change businesses and processes and improve things. And there are a number of things that I've heard that give me some concern. I've almost heard it's not our fault, it's the law. I've heard language and mentality that perhaps misses the strategic importance and intent of the companies that have been giving evidence to us. So highlighting as a positive thing the number of meetings that you've had with an individual around judgment and proportionality. For these commercial businesses to want to sit in the UK, time is money. They want to know if they're having a meeting with the CAA that it's fact-based, that they understand the process, that they can provide evidence and have a dialogue as you talk about. And if I'm candid, I almost get a sense of the fact that you don't think it's in the right place. You know, it should be in the Mojave Desert. You don't really like it. It's very busy airspace. You've got a lot to do. We're going to allow 2 launches a year. Is that the right strategic intent from the leadership in the CAA to support a burgeoning industry? So Stephen, if I start with you, but Tim, this really is all in the detail, as you know, we both know.
Yeah, so I mean, if I've created the impression that we are somehow, you know, being reluctantly doing that, then that is the wrong impression. And as I said at the start, the CAA has those 2 roles: you know, core regulatory role in accordance with the statute, but a role to enable a successful, thriving aerospace enterprise. And we have invested significantly over the last 3 years or so. And it goes beyond space into wider innovation areas and advanced air mobility and things like that. So we absolutely want to play our part. I'm not leaning just into the legislation and say, well, it's because the legislation tells us to, and therefore. But what I am saying is that as a civil aviation authority, our authority comes from the legislation, and that is where we are accountable. And so I need to make sure that the civil aviation authority is working within the legislation.
Could you give us for instance, of a tweak that could be made to that would speed up the process? I mean, we heard, for example, the hazard areas in the sky. You know, we take a 100% approach, whereas others will only designate a hazard area where a potential piece of rocket could land. Is that in the legislation?
So I'll ask Tim to I think the particular hazard area that Mr. Hart was talking about was a ground-based hazard area based on the size of the rocket. I'll ask Tim to have the detail, but my understanding is that the figure that we worked on was one which was given to us by Virgin Orbital.
Sorry, forgive me. What would you have us change legally to make this process faster if we accept that we want it to be faster?
So, I mean, it's a really difficult question in advance of doing the lessons identified process. I think it ties into the answer I gave earlier. I wouldn't go at the core safety part of this, because I think that is absolutely vital. But it is that wider consultative, the other checkpoints that every applicant has to deal with. I think there may be flexibility in that area. I think
Sorry,
that would be more
forgive
productive.
me, I'm just genuinely going to press you. You're a very articulate man. Could you give us an example of where we could change the law to speed this process up? Not in terms of implementation of proportionate or an assumption or definition on the ground of what's practicable. Is there anything that stops us doing it faster in law?
I think it is the consultation process. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do a consultation process, but I need to point out that takes a significant chunk of the time.
And the steps in the consultation process are in law?
I believe so. I'll just check with Tim.
Yeah, the requirements to consult particularly on the environmental assessment and then consult the Secretary of State.
Okay, but there are requirements to consult, but the steps of the consultation, because I could consult the chair by having a quick word with him in a corridor or doing a 6-month, 200-page process. So I'm just trying to understand, is it mandated what consultation looks like within law?
I think the requirement to consult or seek consent for the Secretary of State is in law. As I think we demonstrated last year, we were very proportionate in terms of what length of time those consultations were.
Yeah, well, last year we had a bunch of people saying we're worried about regulation stymieing an industry, and this year we find ourselves in receiving the same evidence. So you'll forgive me for being robust. Perhaps another way of putting it, what are you doing to review your existing licensing process to make sure that it is fit for purpose? What have you removed from that process since December?
So since December, we have undertaken some initial lessons learned conversations with the applicants. We are reviewing our regulators' rules at the moment, which is the
so
sort of
the
detail operational level. We have got a list, and we're happy to share with you.
As in things that have actually been removed to make it better. The answer is nothing.
We have adjusted some parts of our process. We particularly want to look at security and finance as we go forward.
Okay, I think
very happy as part of the lessons learnt process. We're very happy.
Let's do this a slightly different way. What are you doing to look at what other countries are doing that perhaps have a different interpretation of reasonably practicable or proportional, or all of these kind of words that are incredibly difficult for engineers and your staff to define in a meeting room in Cornwall, and no wonder it's taken ages. How on earth are they supposed to be able to define that? What are you doing to speak to international partners to improve and steal their ideas if they're quicker and better?
So firstly, I think the main relationship we have at the moment is with the FAA, who've got a sort of a track record, and actually we've been working with them throughout the whole process, where we have been sort of supporting each other through the licensing processes, and actually we've got an ongoing dialogue, which I think the government is helping facilitate with the FAA, about are there some areas where we could put greater reliance on each other's licensing processes, recognising, as Stephen said earlier.
So conversations, dialogue, but no recommendations adopted or practical actions changed as yet?
At a practical level, we've done lots of lessons learned, and we've been able to take...
You'll forgive me. As a former businesswoman, this does sound very civil servicey, where consultations have been had and chats have been had and nothing's been delivered. I'll pause there, Chair.
Thank you, Catherine. Tracy, I think you want to come in.
Actually, Catherine sort of asked the question at the end there, but Sir Stephen, I just wondered, what recommendations would you like us to make as a consequence of this inquiry? What recommendations would make it easier for you to be able to deliver on what you're being asked to do?
So I think that probably the key one is the one that's been mentioned, particularly by Mr. Hart, because it's been obvious to us as well, is the multivarious agencies that license applicants or launch aspirants wish to or have to engage with. That point about some sort of central gateway to help manage that process, I think is really important. I mean, if it's difficult, excuse me, for us as the Civil Aviation Authority to make all of those connections with other aviation authorities, around the launch area. If it's difficult with us to engage with a range of government departments, then it's even more so for commercial entities, and it is very much so for small and medium enterprises, and it might put them off that process. So I think that would be the one that would strike me as a more portal approach there. Now we need to be careful because, again, I come back to our accountability for safety, and we need to make sure that it doesn't become a negotiation around safety. The authority has given us to look after that aspect, but I think that's the one that most strikes me. I mean, the encouragement to move faster, yeah, absolutely. We want to move as fast as possible as well. But we are dependent on the evidence which is given to us, firstly, and so there's a responsibility on industry. And then we need to make sure that we have the right level of engagement throughout this process and reassure. But these things will take time if we're to get this done properly. Because I think it's a vital part of this. I mean, we want it to happen quickly, but having a stable, predictable regulatory environment which allows successful launches is an attractive thing in itself. We know it works in aviation, is that countries look to the UK as a sort of benchmark nation when it comes to aviation regulation, and they want to do their business here as a consequence. We need to create that environment for space as well. And as I say, I come back to the fact that 285 licenses that we've issued so far. This is a thriving area of activity, and we are growing it constantly in line with how the sector actually grows.
Thank you, Tracy. Stephen Metcalfe and then finally Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I want to move to the UK Space Agency, if I may. Good morning. So, what role does the UK Space Agency play in supporting the UK launch sector, and how long have you been involved in that?
So, in terms of launch itself, then it's responsible for delivering Launch UK as a programme, which brings together both the regulatory elements, what we call the delivery aspects of it as well as brokering the international agreements that have been required, both technical and otherwise, outside of the airspace ones that have been which have been run by DFT. And I'm the senior responsible owner for that as a programme. So I have a strong dependency on colleagues in the CAA for the regulatory approach, and it's been a very good and strong relationship in developing those. And I would highlight, though, in terms of going through this exercise, of course, the first launch, there are a lot of lessons that we'll have to learn. We are on the start of that process today, which is starting to collate the lessons that the likes of the CAA have conducted, bringing them together. And I would also agree that one of those early lessons is likely to be the coordination and the engagement across different government departments that customers have to face. More broadly, in terms of launch and the role of the UK Space Agency, we're there really to do three things. First of all is to catalyse investment into the sector. And I wouldn't necessarily agree with Patrick McCall in terms of saying that having had this one event that people are then rushing away. If I look at other launch providers, when we're talking about vertical launch in Scotland, then we're still seeing inward investment. And the likes of UK companies such as Orbex, who are building rockets in Forres in Scotland, have just closed on a significant investment round of £40 million, and they're taking on the operation of the spaceport. Seeing they've got 50 people. That wouldn't happen if we hadn't generated the opportunity and capability to launch in the UK. And similarly, we're seeing that with Saxe-Ford in Shetland as well, where we're seeing a number of other European countries that are coming to the UK because of the regulations that we've got and because of launch. So High Impulse, RFA, a German company. So these are people who've chosen to come to the UK to do their launch activities.
Sorry, just on that, Stephen, if I may, because that's obviously very pertinent to the evidence that we've heard. So you say that they're coming because of our regulations. That this reflects conversations that you've had, that they are positively attracted to our regulations compared to other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at it from another jurisdiction's perspective, in Europe, there are no others that have regulations enforced to enable launch at the moment, whether it's the most likely competitors, Norway, Sweden, and Portugal. None of them have got primary or secondary legislation or regulations in place at the moment that enable them to launch.
So they're attracted by the fact that we have passed the Space Industry Act and we've got the statute there.
Yes.
But we did hear evidence in our inquiry, as you'll remember, from multiple companies who were concerned about the regulatory approach. Are you saying that there are companies that will give evidence to us that actually they think this is the right approach?
Well, there are companies that will give a different version because there are the only regulatory environment that they're aware of is the UK, as opposed to translating from a US regulatory environment into a UK regulatory.
Sorry, Stephen, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I think really what I wanted to explore a bit more was the comments that Mr. McCall had made earlier about the damage to the UK space launch sector following the events in January. And is it because, had the mission been a huge success, I'm now asking you to put words in his mouth, but would he have been saying that this was a great lever to leap forward for the UK space station because it failed? Or is he trying to conflate the two issues of the failure of the mission, or the non-success, perhaps is a fairer way of describing it, and the challenges that the regulatory framework presented?
I mean, you're right, I wouldn't want to put words into his mouth.
So could you speculate?
However, I would observe that whilst the outcome wasn't that we would obviously want, that anybody would have wanted, actually it has continued to demonstrate that we do have primary legislation and secondary legislation that works. We do have regulations and guidance that works. And again, it's the very first time that we've done this. So yes, there are lessons that we've learned, but we've proved the system now. We've got a working spaceport. We've got working regulations. We can actually broker for the airspace that's required for launch with our international colleagues as well. So it can be done. It's not to say it can't be done better and more efficiently, but it can be done. There is nobody else in Europe that can do that at the moment.
So you must be working on how we can do it better, and there will be presumably a process in place. What can the government do? This is my final question, Chairman. What can the government do to improve the situation from where we are now? We've got this working system. It's happened, but surely the government could do more.
And what I'm working on is reinforcing the success that we've already got. And that, I think, is where we need to focus our efforts at the moment, whether that be supporting small companies that want to set up around these spaceports and generate that income, whether it be being access operating on a global market. And as a kind of a slight aside, if you look at the number of small satellites, which is what we're focusing on here, so it's small satellite launch. Back in 2012, there were some 50 small satellites launched into space globally. Last year, there were 1,700. It's a rapidly growing market. And whilst the overall space economy is worth around about $360 billion globally, about 20 billion of that is in launch. But there is a part of that that is an addressable part for the UK. So it has economic value to the UK if you can attract in international players to come and launch from the UK. As well as the points that Melissa was making, there is an element across security. There is an element across knowledge, whether that be through inspiration or increasing skills. And our space workers in the UK have over 2.5 times productivity, so that's an economic output as well. Or indeed, whether it's the prosperity agenda. So that's where we should be focusing on, is catalysing that investment by helping these companies to get off the ground and operate within the UK.
I'll just add a really quick factual point. We've got 38 companies across the space sector, whether that be launch, spaceport range, or satellite companies, who are either in an application process formally or are in pre-application discussions with us. So I think that evidences that there are a range of companies today looking at the UK and the regulatory framework and saying we want to engage with that.
Okay. Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Ian, just a few very brief questions to you. You mentioned that your focus now needs to be on helping companies get off the ground within the wider space ecosystem around launch sites. But how specifically will the UK Space Agency ensure that it attracts future launch missions to Cornwall and other UK spaceports?
Well, part of that is generating clusters of activity around the UK, and we're planning over this spending review period to invest over £70 million in doing that. Whether that's attracting very, very small activities, or whether it's indeed some of the larger aspects that were announced yesterday in terms of British companies being able to compete into Moonlight, which is the ability to provide communications around the moon as well. So there are a number of activities that we're doing that have got specific funding attached to them and that we'll be managing as projects and programs from within the agency.
We've already heard today that it's far cheaper in certain parts of the world to operate launch missions. Do you think that the UK is in a situation where we need to offer subsidies in these early stages of the emerging market?
I think it's important to look at the broader context of that. Josh Weston from Spaceforge alluded to it. If he's going to launch from US, he has to send his staff to the US. Virgin Orbit had 50 people over here in the UK at one point. That's a cost to the company. If you don't have to do that, if you can do it from UK, that's an immediate saving to companies as well. And I'd kind of look at it from the perspective that it's not just about regulations or the cost of launch. You come to the UK because you've got a stable democracy, you've got a stable legal framework, we've got more satellites are insured in the UK than anywhere else across the globe. So you come to the UK for all of those aspects that create the environment in which you would want to launch from the UK from.
And in an ideal world, if you could ask the government to achieve anything, what would you be asking them to do to support the space industry and future launch sites going forward?
I mean, that's in part a policy question for the department to which we're responsible for in terms of Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. I'd probably duck that one to ask from a policy perspective into the department rather than the agency. Our role is to deliver. Of course, we would want to generate people with greater skills, more skills, so we can draw on that. I think one of the challenges that we have across the sector, not just within the agency, is bringing a right number of people with the right level of skills. So anything that we could do to improve that, which we're also doing within the agency, will of course continue to feed at the bottom, whether it be through inspiration or technical training.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have a new Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, and we hope that she'll come soon to give evidence to the committee, and we no doubt will ask about space. Finally, from me, we have two witnesses from the Civil Aviation Authority. As the name implies, this is principally concerned with civil aviation, which is a huge and very important sector, quite a mature one, and I'm conscious that during the pandemic and subsequently, there have been major challenges there. Do you think, on reflection, that the CAA is the right host for this very different character of activity? And if we, or the government, were to look again at the statutes, might it be better to have a separate, focused space regulatory agency?
No, I'm not just saying this because of the role that I'm in at the moment, but I believe it's actually essential that space activity is within the Civil Aviation Authority. When I was doing my preparation 3 years ago for this role, one of my things in my mind was, well, why isn't the CAA doing space as well? And then I came across the fact that this was working through its way through in legislation. Why is that important? That they're joined up in that way. Nothing gets to space, nothing comes back from space without going through air. And so you have all of the coordination issues in relation to airspace control, etc., working with other international authorities. In a more practical sense, the skills and capabilities that you need in relation to doing risk management in space are exactly the same ones as on the air side. And so when I talk about, there's 50 people in the CAA space team, the whole of the CAA virtually was involved in this space activity in some way or other. Lots of reach into the aviation side. Mr. Hart mentioned that his 747 is an experimental 747. It has to be certified by the CAA as an aircraft, and the rocket is done in another part of the CAA. Just all of the organisational synergies are clear. And so I'm absolutely convinced this is the right place for it. Say again that we're not saying that we are perfect, but I think we have got a good framework and we need to keep building on that. And this point about pace applies across the sector. I mean, I'm sure this committee is hearing from innovators in relation to advanced air mobility, air taxis, etc. Exactly the same issue, and we are working on that right now. In terms of that touch on the touch points into to government, and clearly we speak more broadly, but our sponsoring department is the Department for Transport, and I just would want to say that we had great support for them throughout the Virgin orbital process, including support on us doing what was necessary within the timelines which were advertised to ensure this was a safe launch. So we weren't working in isolation. We were working very closely with our sponsoring department and across government, and they were satisfied with what we were doing.
Well, thank you for that. That's very clear. Clearly, the kind of context of today's hearing is that we were very disappointed to hear from some of the stakeholders in the industry about some of their frustrations about the regulatory process. But it's quite right to say and to put on record that you have an important safety responsibility, and it's easier in some ways to have this kind of discussion than a much more difficult discussion if people's lives had been put at risk or worse. And so you do have an important job to do. Clearly, in such a fast-paced industry as space, we need to keep pace with the competition. It's been the strategic ambition of us to be a leading space nation, and that does impose some requirements on the pace of change and innovation in regulators. We're grateful for your assurance that you're up for that change, and the committee will reflect on the evidence that we've heard and make some suggestions to the government and the agency and other stakeholders. But thank you very much indeed for your evidence today and for coming in person, and to those other witnesses that gave evidence early this morning. That concludes this meeting of the committee. Order, order.
Thank you. The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.